Welcome to today's edition of Daytime Dialogues. It's my great pleasure to introduce today a friend who has a very fascinating hobby, but it's more than just a hobby. And Dr. Rochelle Gold. Rochelle is a clinical psychologist in practice in the Chicago area. She's been back in town for many years, even though she's a native Chicagoan. But the reason why we're talking today is because of her role as the co-president of the Chicago Jewish Historical Society. Now, the Historical Society is almost 50 years old, if my math is right, about 45 years old already.
That's correct.
But the Chicago Jewish community is a lot older than that. So thank you, Rochelle, for joining me today. I'm going to have a lot of fun about the history of Chicago.
Good.
So let's get started with a simple thing. Why'd you get involved in the Chicago Jewish Historical Society?
Well, I'm a native Chicagoan. I'm very proud of that. I know about the history of our community. My parents grew up in Chicago. They were part of the generation of Jews whose parents, in other words, my grandparents, came here from Eastern Europe. My parents grew up in the North Lawndale neighborhood, which was had 100,000 Jews at its peak, a thriving center of Jewish life. So I learned about this history from my parents, and I've always wanted to be involved in and give back to the Jewish community in a way that interested me and felt that I'm capable of doing. My parents were members of the Historical Society, and I found some of their newsletters, now we call it a journal, in their home, and that's how I first got interested.
So, you know, every so often I get a newsletter or a journal from the Chicago Jewish Historical Society. There are articles in it. There's new facts. Where are the archives of the Chicago Jewish community?
Okay, so let me just say a word about the journal that you're referring to, and then I'll answer your question about the archives. So the journal, which was originally called a newsletter, we've upgraded it to a journal, has been published since the founding of the society in 1977. It was an outgrowth of the bicentennial, the US bicentennial. There was an exhibit at the Museum of Science and Industry about the Jewish community, one of many exhibits of the ethnic communities in Chicago. And the group that created that exhibit decided to create a historical association for the Jewish community. We have our mission is threefold. It's the discovery of our history, the documentation, and the sharing of our history. So you asked a question about the documentation. Where are the archives? So the Chicago Jewish Historical Society has an administrative space at the Spertus Institute. We have never had our own archives or exhibit space. In the past, when people wanted to donate historic material to us, we would hand it over to the Spertus Institute, which established an archive. Originally, Rabbi Gutstein was the initiator of that, to hold synagogue records. And for decades, a Spertus would enter important material into their archives. But the archives is now closed, unfortunately. It's been closed, yes. It's not well known, but the material is still housed at Spertus, but the archive is closed, which means that they're not accepting any more material, and it's not accessible to researchers who want to look at it.
Well, let's go back to the history of Jewish Chicago.
Yes.
I know one of the great books on it was written by Irving Cutler,
yes.
Who should live and be well. But
yes.
In terms of the history, when did Jews first start coming to Chicago?
So we have records of people who passed through here as early as 1840, possibly even 1839. But the first residents were certainly here in the early 1840s. And they lived downtown at Lake and Wells. In fact, was the site of the first synagogue, which was KAM, Kilat Anshe Mariv, which is now, which was Orthodox then, consisting of, back in the day, of immigrants from the German countries. And that was the source of Jewish immigration at the time.
So we started downtown
Yes,
and then we moved south or we moved west?
we moved west. We moved west and south, but predominantly west. The second wave of immigration, which was the Eastern European immigration, which started in the 1870s, but really picked up after 1880. That group was settled, lived in was the Maxwell Street area.
So there was a big division. When the Jews first came, the German Jews who first came
Yes.
did not want to mix with the Eastern European Jews. And so the neighborhoods were separate also.
That's right. So some of the German Jews who had become successful, they were of a generation preceding the East Europeans and had become more assimilated. They were living in the near south side. So that is correct. They did not live together.
How near south are we talking about? How far south?
Well, okay, we're talking about maybe, I'm not sure of the exact 1200, 2000 south, in that area. We're not talking about Hyde Park yet.
Not Hyde Park yet. So they moved near south were the German Jews.
Yes.
The Eastern European Jews came after the pogroms, I assume, in the late 1800s.
Just a moment. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No problem. And so they came next, and they were moved west.
Yes.
They weren't mixed. At what point, and then the Great West Side, for instance, where your family was from, the North
Yes.
Lawndale, is
Right.
that where that Eastern European population was moved to, or that's still another migration?
No, that's essentially the same population. So after 1900 or so, especially picking up around 1910, many Jews moved from the Maxwell Street area to further west, another couple of miles west, to what is the North Lawndale area. And my grandparents were both examples of that. My mother was the youngest of 8 children. When her oldest brother was born, the family was living in the Maxwell Street area, but they moved to the west side, Lawndale district. And by the way, their address was 1318 Independence Boulevard, which was 2 doors from KINS on Independence Boulevard.
Independence Boulevard.
That's right.
Which was
now,
then the Sephardish shul. It wasn't Knesset Yisrael, it was the Sephardish shul.
Yeah, Nusach Sfard. And fortunately, the building is still there, and it's a Baptist church. But many of the Jewish elements in the building are preserved. If you see pictures of it, yeah.
Wow. And Rabbi Beryl Wine talks
Yes.
about his memories of growing up in the Old West Side. And one of the stories he tells is that 40,000 people were walking to Tashlich on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. Is that a memory of a child? But given that there were 100,000, it's kind of hard to imagine 40,000 of them were walking.
I don't think that's an exaggeration. I think it was, there were probably 100 or so shuls, including Shtiblach, and maybe a handful of ones that were not Orthodox. So it was an Orthodox, or certainly a traditional neighborhood. And I think that it could be that there were tens of thousands of Jews walking to Tashlich.
Wow. And when do we start seeing the influence of the Jewish community in the general community? When was Julius Rosenwald involved?
Well, Julius Rosenwald was from the German population. And in fact, he lived near Abraham Lincoln's home in Springfield in his early years. So the impact of the Jews on the general population began almost immediately with that first generation of German Jews. Julius Rosenwald, who became the president of Sears and a huge philanthropist in the Jewish community and the general community. He was head of the Jewish, what was the Federation, Federated Jewish Charities at some point. He has many accomplishments to his name. So he was active, you could say, after the turn of the century. That was his primary years of his activity. But Jews were influential in the 1800s, before the turn of the century.
Were there any great names that we would recognize from the early Jewish migration into Chicago?
Right. So Grunnebaum, is that a name that's familiar? Henry
So who was he?
Grunnebaum. So he was an early, from a family that came early from, I think, Bavaria. And the family was in the banking business, went into the banking business, and had a bank. It was called Grunnebaum Brothers. I think I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly. I think it might be Grunnebaum, but so they were an influential family, certainly. There were also some early members of the political community in Chicago, and I guess I can't pull up any names right now, but I think in the finance world, the retail world, many of the department stores in Chicago that were founded, really that's from the German Jewish generation. That was the first ones to establish those. Hart, Schaffner, and Marx, for example, which was no longer exists, but there were others that were dominated by Jews. Those are some examples.
And what were, we see first the German Jewish population coming. We then see the shift away from tradition. The Eastern European Jews coming, they bring back tradition, the shift away from tradition again. If you were to define, what were the key eras of Chicago Jewish population? We started, I guess, 1840. We arrive German Jewish until 1860, 70?
Yes.
Okay. Then the Eastern European. When's the next major shift? World War I, World War II, between the wars?
Well, as we know, the Jewish immigration to the United States from Europe pretty much came to a halt, in the by 1924 with the change in immigration laws when quotas were imposed. So there wasn't a lot of new blood coming into the community after the 20s. I would say that the next phase would be those that the first generation of Jews, the ones who were born in America, whose parents were immigrants. What did they do? What happened to them? So that would be my parents' generation. So those are the people who created communities, institutions, wanted to see how those people wanted to raise their children. So a lot of the ATT, a lot of the educational, the structures of the community, the charity organizations, the educational institutions, all of these became well developed, starting in the 20s through the 40s. I'd say was a period of institutional community development. Yes.
And so early 1920s, the Board of Jewish Education comes.
Yes.
Alexander Dushkin establishes the Board of Jewish Education, tries to coordinate all of the Talmud Torahs that existed. The Associated Talmud Torahs is founded in 1929 as a breakaway from the Board of Jewish Education.
Hebrew Theological College. And,
Hebrew Theological College, which is its 99th year, getting ready for its centennial.
Yes,
so
and the College of Jewish Studies was also established in the 20s. Yeah.
Also, College of Jewish Studies, which is now Spertus.
Spertus Institute.
Right. So those institutions were started then. Day schools really didn't start until the 1940s.
40s.
Ida Crown was in 42. Hebrew Parochial School was not long after. And so that started. Do we have any demographics of things like how many Jews who came from the in that first migration of Eastern European Jews, their children, if their children were still observant. Do we know any of those statistics?
They might be out there, but I don't know them.
Rabbi Menachem B. Sachs had a very famous piece. He talked about the four sons at the Seder. And he said the first son is the grandfather who came from Europe, the Chacham. The next son is the son who rebelled, which unfortunately happened in many communities, in many families, where the next one rebelled, the Russia. The next one is the grandchild, who is the Tam, simple son. He doesn't really know a lot. And the next one already, the great-grandson, is the She'eno Yodea Lishol, has been so far removed, doesn't even know what to ask anymore. And Chicago, when he spoke of that, was really pretty much that kind of picture, that we weren't doing so well a couple of generations in. Is in your work in the Chicago Jewish Historical Society today, have there been things that you found out, that you've discovered, that have really been surprising, maybe even shocking, that have been uncovered?
Let's see. Before I tell you what has stood out for me, I just want to comment on that.
Yeah.
That scenario of the four with the declining generations, declining Jewish involvement. I think if you look at the surveys, you'll find, the data that corroborates that. Increasing intermarriage, less involvement, connection to Judaism by many other markers. But I'm optimistic. I think that we have quality. I think we have to look at what is the quality of the community, not just the numbers. And I think that we have a core of very educated, committed, dynamic people in our Jewish community and in other Jewish communities. And I hope that they will take the cycle forward in a positive direction.
Oh, we've shifted, by the way, when Rabbi Sachs said that, it was at the beginning, the birth of day schools. And that was part of his point, was how Jewish education could shift. It's fascinating. I was once told that there are, at a time, and I don't know if, I doubt this is true anymore, but there were no Chicago families where they could say they were 5 generations and still from. But
well, first of all, there aren't that many generations of Chicagoans. We haven't been here for 5 generations. So at best, I would say 4.
well, actually, in my family, just my grandparents came. My grandparents came, and my grandchildren are here. So you. So we're beginning to get that, actually.
Yes.
From the people who came to Chicago.
Yeah.
Pre-world, generally it's either pre the World Wars or around the time of the World Wars.
Yeah.
My family came early part of the 1900s on one side of my family, the other came the early 1920s after World War I. So I have great hope. Chicago is an amazing community. I don't want to, God forbid, say something to the contrary.
Right.
It's interesting though, when we look at Chicago Jewish community, there's a couple of things that stand out, and I hear this also from people in other communities, that Chicago has a greater sense of cohesiveness in the Jewish community. The Federation in Chicago is known across North America as one of the strongest federations, that there is a lot more connection among the Jews in Chicago. Maybe it's because of Federation, maybe because of other things. Have you looked at this as a historian and said, what makes Chicago Jewish community different than other communities? You thought about that?
Yeah, so first, and this will connect to the question I didn't answer, your previous question about what maybe has stood out for me in our history. And one of the things that did stand out was how when people came here, they didn't have much money, they didn't have much material things, but they wanted to give what they could to make their communal institutions the best they could. So they built beautiful shuls, and they they would invest in the Jewish community. Their own personal living circumstances were modest. So I think that kind of an ethic, has, and I don't think Chicago is unique in this, but I think that maybe it's the Midwest kind of a thing, that we're not flashy. The things that matter, we do them. We don't want a lot of attention for it. We just do what has to be done, and we're people of substance. So I think that has carried over, over the decades. Somehow it's been transmitted, that kind of value system. And why is Chicago less fragmented, perhaps, than other cities? Again, I think that it's possibly a function of the way our neighborhoods have been, how our neighborhoods tend to be concentrated. Ethnically, that's a Chicago demographic feature. We're not as spread out like New York is very, very spread out, and communities are it's difficult for them to be cohesive, because they're not near each other. Here we have contiguity, which also is helpful. And I think our leadership, I'll say, including you, you're part of our leadership. I think the kind of leadership we've had in Chicago has emphasized consensus building, community building, not instead of partisanship, divisiveness. It makes a difference.
If we talk about Chicago and we talk about neighborhoods, so when I think of the Jewish neighborhoods, and tell me which ones I'm missing. I'm thinking of Maxwell Street, I'm thinking of South Shore, of Hyde Park, of Lawndale, of, I'm also thinking of, we can start moving near north or the northwest side.
Humboldt Park.
Boston, Humboldt Park, Albany Park, and West Rogers Park, Peterson Park. We have a lot of parks in our life, apparently.
Right, that's right.
Okay, and then you have now Skokie, which is really almost still, even though it's the suburbs, it's still connected versus the North Shore with Highland Park and Deerfield, et cetera, and Buffalo Grove and further Morton Grove and other communities out there. How many of these communities are still this Jewish sense? Growing up, we both grew up around the area of West Rogers Park. I remember Devon in its heyday, when it was a Jewish neighborhood, and when you'd walk down Devon and you'd have all the stores east of California were the stores, west were some of the Jewish institutions as well. We have more institutions today, but it was a shopping center versus what is today. And even though Skokie has a large population, Dempster has never been like Devon was. And Devon, I don't know if it was the same as Lawrence Avenue had been, and I'm sure there are other avenues along the way. Do we still have that sense of neighborhood in our Jewish community? Or is it something that's just remaining with, let's say, the Orthodox community that has to be close because of Shabbat?
I think the latter. I think it's mostly the Orthodox community still has that sense of place, of having to be near each other because of Shabbat, and in going to shul, having to walk to shul. I don't think there are any arteries, shopping areas that you could go through in Chicago outside of West Rogers Park and identify them as, oh, there must be a lot of Jews living here because look what I see. There is some of that in Skokie, but it's not as concentrated.
And your work with the Chicago Jewish Historical Society, how often do you meet?
So we have a board of directors. And by the way, we're all volunteers except for the editor of our journal, Robert Nagler Miller. And I want to say about our journal, this is our most recent issue. Okay. It's a quarterly journal, and all the issues can be read. They're archived on our website, chicagojewishhistory.org. So it's a really great journal, and I recommend people, go and check it out. So we have a board of directors. We meet monthly. We have various committees like other organizations, but we as our mission to educate the community, we have public programs. So those before COVID, we would hold about four to five programs per year at different sites around the city so that we could make it convenient for people who live in different places. And anyone was welcome to come to those programs. So now we've had Zoom programs for the last, almost 2 years, which anybody can attend. We have one coming up on March 6th with one of the regional directors of ADL. By the way, ADL was founded in Chicago in 1913 when it was a project of B'nai B'rith. And I'll say our last program was in January. We partnered with another Chicago organization called the Caxton Club. There is a collector of Haggadahs in Chicago named Stephen Derschlag, who has the largest collection of Haggadahs in the world. And he has promised to donate them to the University of Chicago Library, and he gave a program about his. So that's an example of the range. We have a range of programs that we give.
And again, your website, the chicagojewishhistory.org, has information on on programs, on the journal that comes out, other information that comes out.
Right.
And research about the Chicago Jewish history, is that being done by members? Are there historians who are working on it?
Well, we don't have historians per se that we fund research. However, we're a community organization. So we want history to come from the people who actually lived that history or, knew about it from their families or studied it. So our journal has articles by some people who are professional historians, but mostly people in the community who have things to say about our community that the rest of us don't know about.
And just to circle back, where our time's almost up, but to circle back to some small thing you mentioned about the archives being closed.
Yes.
That's troubling.
It is, and we're going to hopefully try to work on that. And because we often get we get offers from people who want to donate material. And I want to say one more thing about research. Through our website, people contact us from all over the world to ask if we could help them with some things that they're looking into. These could be students, it could be professors, it could be just everyday people. And that is another thing that we do. We try to help them as best we can. If not with our own materials, we'll refer them to others.
No, I still remember when Rabbi Leonard C. Mishkin had retired from Associated Talmud Torahs, and I think it was about 1980, 79 or 80. Actually, it was earlier than that, about 75 or 76. He had journals and he had articles and things of Associated Talmud Torahs. And I remember someone from not long after, from the archives coming to try to collect things and take it to the archives so those are preserved. So I hope among the many things that you'll be accomplishing that those archives will be reopened. I'm sure they're a treasure trove for historians. I believe it or not, our time is up, and I want to thank you. And again, encourage people who want to get involved, chicagojewishhistory.org. Remind people that this Dialogues also is available as an Apple podcast. You can go on the Apple Podcasts in the next couple of hours. It'll be able to be downloaded or listened to that way. And I want to thank Dr. Gold for her time. And there's a lot more to learn about the history of Chicago Jewry. And there's a lot more to do to create the history in the future. So thank you so very, very much. Have a wonderful day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.